All right, I'm going to start with the bad news. We live under the biggest, most powerful, arguably, government in the history of the world. This is a government, a federal government, that tells you how much water you can have in your toilet and what kind of light bulbs you can screw into your light fixtures. That's a pretty darn powerful government. Now here's the good news. There is a way to undermine that massive centralized power. I want to talk real quick about how we can do that practically. The first thing that I want you to do, this is my first piece of important advice. Never, ever call the 202 area code. Just don't do it. Those of you who aren't area code savvy, that's Washington, D.C. Now, my daughter lives in D.C., I'm allowed. The rest of you don't ever call Washington, D.C. What I'm talking about really here is a shift in mindset. We tend to, as Americans, if we have any interest in politics at all, we tend to focus our attention on the presidential race and maybe a congressional race or our congressman. This is a complete waste of time if you care about liberty, because these people don't care about liberty. It's like changing out the driver in a broken down car, right? If I have a car, it's up on blocks, wheels are falling off of it, there's no motor in it, I'm sitting in the driver's seat and I get out and my wife gets in the driver's seat, that car still ain't going nowhere. She looks a lot better than me, but the car's not going to go anywhere because the car itself is broken. And that's where we are. When we have a centralized government that's telling you how much water you can put in your toilet, you have a very, very big problem. And big is intentionally being said there. And I see this tendency, though, even in libertarian circles. We get into this, we think if we can just get the right president, the right guys in Congress, or maybe if we can get a good Supreme Court, then we can get liberty. Because we'll get a Supreme Court and they'll impose liberty from on high. Well, first off, you don't impose liberty. That's not a thing. And the second thing is, again, these politically connected lawyers, they don't care about liberty. They're part of this centralized machine. You're asking part of the federal government to rein in the federal government. It doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't work, and we've seen it not work. Now, you may get a victory, but if some guy on the court says that you can have an AR-15, you've lost. You might have won the battle, but you've lost the war, because that same guy, you've given him the power to make that decision for you. So what we're talking about here is, as Ryan said, a radical decentralization, and I would be remiss being in Mises thing if I didn't read a little bit of Rothbard. He said, in the U.S., it becomes important in moving towards such radical decentralization for libertarians and classical liberals, indeed for many other minority or dissident groups, to begin to lay the greatest stress on the forgotten 10th Amendment and to try to decompose the role and power of the centralizing Supreme Court. Rather than trying to get people of one's own ideological persuasion on the Supreme Court, its power should be rolled back and minimized as far as possible, and its power decomposed into state or even local judicial bodies. So we're talking about this in the judicial system, but I would say this applies to the executive, it applies to Congress. We need to focus our attention not on Washington, D.C. Stop calling the 202 area code and focus on state and local government. Well, you say, well, what's the state government going to do to the biggest, most powerful government in the history of the world? Well, I'm glad you asked, because this is the key. Nullification. You've heard this word mentioned a few times over the last yesterday and today. Basically, it's just saying no. It's using local jurisdictions to undermine federal power. James Madison gave us this blueprint in Federalist 46 even before the Constitution was ratified. He said, if the federal government commits an unwarrantable act, unconstitutional, or even a warrantable act that just happens to be unpopular, he said the means of opposition are powerful and at hand. And he listed out some things he could do, and the most significant is a refusal to cooperate with officers of the union. Just say no to the feds. When they come along and say, we're going to enforce gun control, the state can say, no, we're not doing that. We've seen this work. Marijuana is the prime example. I have in my wallet a little card. I can go to a store here in Florida, and I can get weed. Ooh. The federal government says this is illegal, but this is moved to such a level at the state and local level that there's no way that the federal government can do anything about it. And here's the dirty little secret. The federal government depends on state and local actors to do virtually everything that they do. Without that state and local support, they can't do squat. They can't enforce COVID rules. They can't enforce gun control. They can't impose a medical system. They can't have the war on drugs. Heck, they can't even have the military-industrial around the world empire building without the National Guard. So we have a powerful thing here that we can use, nullification. To learn more, go to 10th Amendment Center, all spelled out.com, and you will see how we're putting this strategy into practical effect.